Okay, we enter into 2 Samuel 15 today, beginning the story of Absalom's rebellion. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this section in 2 Samuel 15 to 18, I really encourage you to do so, where we go over some of the things you'll see on the right side of the screen just briefly today, including this shape and literary style of the Absalom rebellion. And I'll just note here that it's worth paying attention to these various stylistic elements that are not unique to this passage but are emphasized here, including the frequent use of henna, behold, and the infinitive absolute, which doubles verbs and underscores their importance, as well as a number of other elements in terms of characters, deception, action, ironic humor, and gaps, and we'll see more of that as we go. And I also encourage you to go back and consider the three major interpretive options for the entire story here. And again, I won't go over them in detail, they're on the introductory video, but to note these three possible ways. Following Nathan's word in 2 Samuel 12, a sort of secular analysis of David's failure to do what kings do, or perhaps a deeper consideration that David's been playing a long con here and is setting it up so that Solomon will be the succession. And we can't answer that question until we get all the way through it, but we'll try to hold all those together as we go. And you can also see this version of the shape of this section up through chapter 18 with a focus on Absalom, then on David, then on Absalom, and then on both of them together. We can note that in another way established by Fackelman here, looking at the larger unit of 15 to 20, we can see this chiastic shape. It's not a tight chiastic shape as we did last time, but certainly shows that it sets up for the climax to be the death of Absalom and then coming down to the end when Amasa is killed and the monarchy is again restored to the hand of David alone. And I was noting all the various characters along the way, and we won't see many of them now, but we'll see many of these as we go. Color-coded for the green on the Absalom side and the purple on the David side. And although there are many more listed for David, as I noted last time, all of Israel is on Absalom's side, and a number of these are individuals. This is highlighting that David is not representing Judah, but simply representing a coalition of people from various places who work for him. So as we begin to enter into our scene here in 15:1 to 6, you can see on the left side of the screen, I'll note the key words and shape of this section, not so much of 1 to 6, but of the entire chapter for now. If I scroll back out and you can see the big picture, so the block here is a chiasm that you can see in this shape. I'll zoom in on it a little bit, around David, when the action turns from Absalom to David. So we see in this first unit, obviously Absalom's name is used many times in relation to the king. Notice he's never David in this section except the narrator's reference to David's counselor Ahithophel, but otherwise it's Absalom against the king. And a number of places in the chapter where the New RSV says all or people or something generic like that, I've rendered it in the gender-exclusive form that the text has man or men, because this is a very male scene. There's no question about the entire Bible is in a patriarchal context, but this is particularly male for two reasons. It's war and politics, which is a realm of male power in a patriarchal setting, but it's also in the public sphere. So in the patriarchy of the biblical world, the private sphere in the home is women's space. So we see, for example, in Genesis, in the tent, Sarai tells Abram what to do, and he does it. And many other times when women are in their private space, say Rachel and Leah, they tell Jacob what to do and he does it. But this is public space. It's not women's realm, and it's a very male space. So I've highlighted that Absalom speaking to the men of Israel, not the people of Israel. And then when we look further down, we'll see the shape of the David scene here rising up as he goes up the ascent of the Mount Olives in this chiastic form. And then we'll see highlighted the repeated names of some of the people that are important to him, Zadok and Abiathar, the two major priests. So there aren't as many key words, except we'll see down here the repeated use of ever, from which we get Hebrew for pass through. And that's a characteristic that I didn't put in the shape and literary style element, that there are often key words used in little sections rather than just in whole big units and chapters. So with that in mind, let's leave up our key words here because it has some translation details that I'll highlight, and we'll start on the left side in verse 1. So notice the juxtaposition of what we saw at the end of chapter 14, after all those years of Absalom not being able to meet with his father the king and burning down Job's barley field to get his attention. Finally gets his attention. It says the king kissed Absalom, and we might think, well, they're reconciled. But with no intervention, suddenly after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses. So we can see plainly whatever happened that the king kissed Absalom, it was not peace, it was not shalom. Absalom interpreted that as a time for him to rebel. And throughout this section, I want to highlight this is happening on the streets of Jerusalem, apparently right outside David's palace. There's no Jerusalem temple yet, of course, which will be built by Solomon. But this is happening in the streets, as you can see in this classic picture of Absalom getting himself a chariot, or as we'll see in a minute when he's down in the streets talking to people. And one of the questions we need to pay attention to is, how could David not know this is happening? As we'll see next time in verse 7, it says that Absalom's doing this for 4 years, and David seems to have no awareness of it. That doesn't seem possible. This could be happening literally outside his window every day or very often, and have him have no clue. Certainly he'd be informed of it. So I just wanted to keep that in mind in terms of the gap about David's intentions here. So Absalom got himself a chariot and 50 men to run before him, as Adonijah will do in 1 Kings 1-5, as you can see down below. The word for chariot, Merkavah, was only once previously in Samuel, when it was the warning. We can go back and look at that briefly. The warning from Yahweh via Samuel to the people, this is the ways of your kings. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, to run before his chariots. And that's exactly what's happening here. 50 men to run ahead of him. And so this is the first chariot in the Bible that's by an Israelite, or indigenous, as I put it down below, to include people like Judahites. Joseph has a chariot, but he's in Egypt. He's no longer in the land, and he's working for Pharaoh, and it's not even his chariot. Egypt's second in command, it says, allowed Joseph to be in his chariot. So this is the first Israelite to have a chariot here, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And horses. Absalom will die in his mule, but here he's riding horses. Sus is the Hebrew word, and only here in Samuel. And that also will echo what we see in Deuteronomy 17:16. If 1 Samuel 8:11-17 is the inside the narrative statement of why kings will take. Deuteronomy 17:14-20 is the after the fact, probably from the time of Josiah in roughly the 630s BCE time, when looking back on Solomon, they put in a number of things in the mouth of Moses that is clearly about taking down Solomon, the very Solomon who's being arranged to be king in the passage we're on here. So when we look back at 17:16, we see the king must not acquire many horses for himself, or specifically return to Egypt to acquire more horses. Absalom here is not directly associated with Egypt, but he's certainly acquiring horses. But we can't assume that the text knows about Deuteronomy or the original audience knows about Deuteronomy. That's a reflection after the fact. So 50 men, that's a pretty good number. It's not big enough to defeat the king, but he's just getting started. This is the first verse. To run ahead of him. So literally running before his face, and I'll point out a number of times where the text leaves out body parts, hands, faces, feet, and various things like that. And the Hebrew Bible is very earthy that way, and it's unfortunate that the New Revised Standard and other translations often leave that out, and actually I left it out here on the right, but I'll fix that before I post it at radicalbible.net. So notice what it's telling us here is a practice. He got himself a chariot, and that seemed like one event, but what we're seeing now is a practice. And as Alter notes below about these next 4 verses, he says, a stylized representation of the operation of a demagogue who enlists support by flattering people's special interests. The heart of Absalom's demagogic pitch is his exploiting what must have been widespread dissatisfaction over the new centralized monarchic bureaucracy with its imposition of taxes and corvees and military conscription. And as Halpern notes further, note how Absalom determines that the petitioner is an Israelite, then promise them a favorable ruling as a means to enlist Israelite support for his Judahite rebellion. So with those thoughts in mind, let's look more carefully what the text says. And we should note at the beginning, although many texts and many commentators start with Absalom the traitor or Absalom the rebel, what Absalom is going to do is appeal to the lack of justice, and he would not be able to get people to listen to him unless he was appealing to something that was at least somewhat real. In the time I'm making this video, people can appeal to all things that are not real, like immigrants taking their jobs or crime going up and all kinds of counterfactual things like that, in a world where technology has made it very difficult for ordinary people to know what's really happening. But in the streets of Jerusalem, there's no obfuscation. People can know directly whether they're getting justice from the king or not. And so Absalom is proposing to remedy what must be a real problem. That doesn't mean he's not doing it for his own purposes or he's doing it perhaps in a slippery way. But there'd be no room for a demagogue or a populist if there wasn't a problem to be addressed. So it says his practice is to rise early and stand, or literally take his stand. As Sanders notes, he stations himself at a point where he can control access to a resources that are apparently more important than wealth or soldiers, people hoping for a judgment, which is to say the gate. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, the prophets often note how there's no justice at the gate, which is not just what we think of as a doorway, but a social space where there's a filter basically for people trying to come in the city, but also where people gather for justice to be done. And you see in my note below some examples from Deuteronomy of that. But let's look more carefully at what is being said that he's offering. So when anyone, or literally any man, brought a suit before the king, a reeb, which is the Hebrew word for a controversy or a lawsuit. It's only in a couple of places earlier in 1 Samuel in the Nabal story, and here in when David's trying to escape from Saul, and only one other time. But it's common in the prophets. Brought a suit before the king for judgment, assuming that that's what's happening. And notice, David is the king. So when a man brought a suit before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out and try to usurp that. So the scene is that people are coming to the gate to get judgment from the king. And as you can see in verse 3, Absalom would say, there's no one from the king to hear you. And we'll look more closely at that language in a minute. So they're looking for judgment. The king isn't available, and Absalom is filling the breach. The word for judgment here, lamishpat here, and we'll see that that's what he offers, offering to provide the justice not found in the monarchy. And notice the call and response here and how the difference between the call and the response. Absalom would call out here, and as Sanders again notes, it is the dialogic quality of Absalom's challenge that distinguishes it from the common ancient Near Eastern royal claim to be a just judge, protector of widows and orphans. So he's doing it in conversation. And we'll see the egalitarian nature. He's trying to say, I'm not like a king. I'm certainly not like David. From what city are you? And notice he's been formed in a way to think that people identify with cities. The city of David is what Jerusalem is, but the response is different. That when the person said, your servant is from such and such a tribe, or literally of one of the tribes, sometimes such and such in English is translating a phrase in Hebrew that is much like such and such, this and that, or something non-specific. But here it is specific, one of the tribes. Notice the tribe is not being named, and nowhere throughout this is there a sense of named tribal identities. But he's basically saying the tribe, the Shevet here, is his source of identity, not city life. And we'll see how that plays out in the next generation when Solomon does become king. As Graham Auld notes below, are the visitors deliberately correcting Absalom's terminology, pointing out that the basic units of self-identity in Israel are tribes and not towns? And I would say so. As you can see from above that in my note below, Shevet declines as the Deuteronomistic history continues. So it's 51 times in Deuteronomy and Joshua. Even if those texts are written later than Samuel, we see the uses in Samuel and very rarely in 2 Kings when tribal identity has basically been destroyed at that point. But tribal identity still exists here, and we'll see before this story is over, and certainly before the monarchy story is over, Israel, as opposed to Judah, will still identify with that ancient form of organization. Moving into verse 3, as Halpern notes, ironically enough in the text, David has just given hearings to two petitioners, Nathan and Joab's wise woman of Tekoa, whose cases cloak their real purposes. So in the face of the idea that nobody can get to the king, in fact, there have been. As Halberstal and Holmes note below, he thus begins to peel away David's support by offering himself as the people's champion. Such pandering is politically costless, and it has an effect on discontented suitors, even when they have good reason to be skeptical of empty promises. And we'll see in verse 4 how empty the promise is. Slavin would say, hey, or see, or behold here, your claims are good and right, or literally your words. Notice he's saying that without any evidence. He's just making a generic statement to anybody who comes, I'm on your side. And obviously in a lawsuit there have to be two sides, and he can't be on everybody's side, but it's the nature of politicians even 3,000 years ago. So your words are good and right. Hendaiad is here forming those together here. Nachoach here, only here in the Deuteronomistic history along with Tov. And you see a couple of other places where they're used together in Isaiah and in Proverbs. Absalom subverts the Deuteronomistic law, if considered known at the time of writing, which is probably not, in order to gain a following. As Bodner notes below, many politicians throughout history have been accused of making promises that cannot possibly be kept. And in this vein, we are entitled to wonder how Absalom can make the assurance that every plaintiff would be declared righteous. And that's what we hear here. And no one deputed, that's not in the Hebrew here. So literally, no one from the king to hear you. And so continuing on here, as Halpern, I already noted that here, that verse here in verse 4, sorry. As I note below, the contrast between this law and in Deuteronomy 25, and Absalom's behavior is clear and simple. Let's look at that briefly since it was referred to twice now. Suppose two persons have a dispute and enter into litigation, and the judges decide between them, declaring one to be in the right and the other to be in the wrong, etc. And yet what Absalom is doing is declaring everyone to be in the right. Let's look more closely at his words. Is he saying this to himself, or is he saying it's in the street? We don't know. The phrase for if only here, ami yisamani, is hard to translate literally. It literally means who put. So it's who put in the role of judge, and the North V renders that as if only I were judge. Using shofet here, the first mention of judges since Samuel's sons, back in 1 Samuel 8, and the popular hearkening for return to the pre-monarchical structure. But that's not what he will be. He will not be a judge. He will be a king. Notice judge in the land, not over the people, not in Israel or over Judah, as if he's going to judge the creatures of the earth or the land itself. But that's not what happens. It's to avoid giving a specific political label or boundary to where his authority would be. Then all who had a suit or cause. As Falkman notes, justice is simply the weak spot to which he applies his political lever and aggrandizes himself by doing what a true judge can never do, namely favor everyone. And notice the various scholars all coalescing around that point. A suit or a cause, here using rib again here, or mishpat, so combining the words that we'd heard earlier. And I would give them tzedakah. So if everybody can come, you can't give justice. Because as Walter Brueggemann noted many decades ago, the now beloved sainted late Walter Brueggemann, biblical justice is determining what belongs to whom and giving it back. So in other words, arranging things justly, not just procedural justice as in the United States system, where if you get due process, it's just regardless of the outcome, but where the outcome is justice, what we might call equity, more than justice. They didn't have a specific word for that. But you can't do that to everybody, because if somebody has less and somebody has more, and you take from the more to give to the more has less, and they might not see that as justice. It would be for the whole, but not for the individual. So he's promising what's impossible, but what else is new among politicians? So we hear the outcome. Whenever people, or literally a man, came near to do obeisance to him, to bow down before his superior power, he put out his hand to take hold of them and kiss them. And as Sanders notes, this charismatic move performatively enacts an egalitarian ideal, demonstrating he is not above or remote from his constituents. I'm just like you. Hand on the shoulder. And kiss them. Echoing, of course, David's kiss, which you recognize did not mean peace. And so does it mean anything here? Almost certainly not. And so the conclusion of this here is, thus Absalom did to every Israelite who came to the king for judgment. Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And the reason it's steal, of course, is because it's not true. He's offering them a con, that he can give justice to everybody, satisfy all their needs. And he obviously can't do that. So he didn't win their hearts by offering a real possibility. He stole their hearts with deception. Literally, though, it's singular. The heart of the men. So one heart of the men of Israel. And here's where we see it mentioned as Israel. And as my note down below has, I got to look and see who it's from. I don't remember off the top of my head who JW is, so I'll look that up and post it on the video. He says, or she says, within the succession narrative, the lines of division initially do not run between Israel and Judah. Absalom wins the heart of, quote, Israel, which appears to include the population of Judah as well, since the text is taking place in and around Jerusalem here. He is made king in Hebron, which we'll find out soon enough. You see it in verse 9 below. The erstwhile capital of the Judahite kingdom, before finally assuming the throne in Jerusalem. David's supporters are called his people, sometimes with the meaning of army, rather than Judah. That the authors introduced tensions between Israel and Judah into the story at the very end of the Absalom account must be related to the immediately following episode we'll see in chapter 20. So continuing, weaving the originally separate accounts of Absalom's and Sheva's rebellions into a continuous narrative, the redactors, to say the editors, depict a growing tension between Israel and Judah during David's journey back to Jerusalem. In this way, they constructed a new context for understanding Israel's succession under Sheba. That whole quote is anticipating later parts in the story, but it's worth noting here at the very beginning to highlight how the writers are not only anticipating Absalom's rebellion, they're certainly anticipating Israel's rebellion from Solomon's son Rehoboam just 2 generations later. So this is setting that all up. as we go. So we'll see, as you can already see in verse 7, 4 years pass that Absalom's doing this. What will be the effect of this, and what will happen when he finally gets an audience with his father, the king, to make his plot move forward? We'll see you for that next time. Bye-bye.